Welcome everyone. I'm Richard Seymour. I'm a second-year MBA student here and outgoing co-president of the Sports Business Club here at London Business School. My last act as role of president here, I'm really proud to welcome you all to our inaugural Sports Business Conference here. We've got a stellar lineup of speakers from all walks of sport with many years of experience in teams, leagues, organising bodies, agencies and rights holders from the States through Europe, through the Middle East and beyond. So we've got a real global perspective here. I'm really excited for this conference today. So during the evening, feel free to tweet or retweet using the hashtag LBSSC, which is on the top right there, and we'll monitor them. And if you've got any questions for panelists, please tweet using that hashtag. And also, please respect our speakers' wishes if they ask to keep some of the details of the conversation within this room. I now introduce Professor Voss, who is the moderator of our first panel. He is Emeritus Professor of Operations Management here at London Business School, where he's also served as Deputy Dean. And he's also an alumnus of the school, where he gained his Masters and PhD. He's widely published and has researched and written extensively in the areas of service operations, including sports and entertainment. His teaching includes the Managing Sports Entertainment elective, which I took a few weeks ago, which was my final and also my favourite class of the MBA. So, without further ado,
first year's enrolled, please.
I'll pass you over to Professor Voss to introduce the panel.
Excellent.
How do you want them to
Yeah.
All up here.
All first, could we ask
the first panel?
Tom, Brett, Alistair, Rick and Kevin all come up, please. We have assembled, as I said, a stellar panel from representing sport from both the club perspective and the sport perspective. We're going to ask each of them to speak for 7 to 10 minutes about the globalisation of their particular sport, their positioning and their ideas, their challenges within this. I won't introduce you. See that Tom from Arsenal, Brett from International Rugby, Alistair from NFL, Rick, former CEO of Liverpool and the FA Premier League, and Kevin from the British Basketball Union. So you've got their outstanding careers as well as this. I don't have time to go through each of their outstanding careers. So what I'm going to do is ask each of them to talk. Yeah, exactly. And I've asked each of them to give their perspective and from their sport or their club or both. And I'm going to ask Alistair from NFL to give the NFL perspective on globalisation of the NFL.
Okay, do I sit or stand or
whatever you like.
Run?
As long as you pick the pass on the way.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll go relax and I'll sit. I'm glad that we've set the bar low with me to start off with. No pressure on anybody else. I was actually just thinking as I was walking in that with Tom being an American, being senior at Arsenal, and myself as a Scot having been with the NFL for quite a while, and yet still not quite having developed the American accent, at least from an employment perspective, we can show that we're actually global in how we think. The NFL is an interesting case study as to how we are trying to go about trying to build a global sport, because in many ways we are a dominant sport domestically, and that leads to challenges when we look at how we try and build internationally. The first thing to say is that we're not a federation. So although most fans of American football, unless you go to certain colleges, will think of us as the gatekeeper of American football, we don't control the sport. We're a professional league of 32 teams. We're democratically structured. We're in a situation where 24 out of our vote yes to a particular given proposal. As a result, we're a relatively conservative league because with any form of democracy leads to a lot of debate, and also means that you give a lot of thought as to how you go about doing things. As a result, domestically, we have built a league that has been superbly structured, and I think last year, of the top 30 most watched programs, not sports programs, most watched programs, 28 were NFL games. So we're used to success domestically, and we've built it in an appropriate fashion. Yet we're not an Olympic sport, which is key, because we don't have support then therefore for federations across the globe to build grassroots. And because we're not the custodians of the sport, we don't actually have a vested primary interest in building the sport like the FA would do with football in this country. When we then try to do as a sport, and looking at all the barriers, the potential barriers that we have, we're perceived as a relatively complex sport, and when you first look at us, we don't have a high percentage of international players, and as a result, our strategy in the last 3 decades has shifted. So in the first 15 years of trying to become truly global, we started off by splattering a little bit of what we do by playing pre-season games. When that had some traction in a few countries, we then moved to a bottom-up approach, which was to invest in leagues that would build grassroots for sustainability. And that didn't work because at the time when we were thinking about doing it, it probably was appropriate, but then media proliferation and the digital explosion and cable explosion, and also the professionalism of sports, meant that other sports were doing things in a completely different way. So our global strategy has been challenging in the first place. It has had, dependent on how you perceive it, either learnings or missteps. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we've changed to a different form of focus, and it's to recognize how society and how business and business of sport has moved, which is that if you want to be a big player in sport, you actually have to put the best possible product out there, and you have to put your best possible wares out there. And on the basis that we are doing so well domestically, that's a challenge, because you don't want to break something that's working, yet at the same time you want to build internationally. So our approach is to focus on a number of narrow countries, so Mexico, Canada, China, Japan, and the UK. Within the UK, we have a plan that is different to the other territories. We play regular season games that should be played in the States, but home teams give up their games and play in the UK in an attempt to build mass scale. We've been playing games since 2007. We've been playing one a year at Wembley. We this year are moving to 2 games and have sold, I think it was 140,000 tickets in January to ensure that they were a success. We have agreement from our ownership to build a platform for more games going forward. So we have approval from at least 24 owners out of the 32, but in this case it's all owners, to play multiple games in this country going forward. And my charge is to build a fan base that is large enough in scale over a period of time that at some point in time we can then take a view as to whether we would ever consider having a team that would be competing in the US-based league based over here. Now that's to get it to a scale where we'd consider to do that. I'm not saying that we would do that. However, if we were at that situation, then that focus would then have proven a case that by putting the best product out there, we are able to take a non-indigenous sport that is not played by the masses and build it in a country which is mad on sport, but also lead to other potential countries going forward. So that's our strategy. It's not without ambition. It's not without risk, and that's one of the reasons why I have all these love lines on my forehead. But I'll be interested to see what everybody else in the panel has to say.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed. Okay, we'll come back to you in a moment. Let's move on to another sport which is also dominant in the States, but has a different and maybe more effective spread around the world, everywhere except the UK, maybe. So Kevin, would you like to a little bit talk about basketball?
So, having had a Scot talking about American football, you get the privilege of a Canadian speaking about basketball in the UK. And the context is that the UK is a home of traditional sports, football, rugby, cricket. And basketball is perceived to be an American sport, when in fact it's very much a global sport. China has 250 million basketball players, almost half of the total number of players in the world. It has professional leagues in every single country in the world, including most of Africa. If you're a professional player, you have teams in Korea, Japan, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, anywhere you can go. The world is your oyster, the opportunity. In the UK, it's always struggled to make an impact at the professional level. If you look at young people, according to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, amongst 10 to 15-year-olds in the UK, the number 2 sport is basketball, second only to football. But what happens is once they go past that age group, the traditional sports dominate in terms of media profile, opportunities, facilities, and everything else. So we have a challenge as a sport in this country to look at how we can drive the sport forward in a very crowded market where there is already a huge existing global framework. And so, for example, last weekend, the O2 was host to the European Champions League. Olympiacos, Real Madrid, Barca all came to the O2 for the European Championships. 18,000 people, unbelievable atmosphere, but probably nobody in this room knew that happened because they were all Europeans coming to watch those games. We had an opportunity at the Olympics for 2012 for Great Britain to compete, men and women, to have our players together, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the challenge of just getting our best players together. And there was an opportunity to see the very best of what Great Britain can do operating at the top level, playing the global superstars that are in the NBA, who comprise the US teams, but also comprise many of the opposition teams. And the piece we're missing is, well, there are several challenges. One of the challenges is a challenge to all sports in the UK, which is we suffer from governing body itis. There are lots of governing bodies, Wales, Scotland, England, GB team, all set up, all many, many years old, and all with their own politics and importance and so on. So we've got that as a general issue. How do you come together as a sport? The NFL doesn't have to worry about that. They come into the country and they pretty much do what they like. There is no country in the world you can go and play basketball without there being a governing body which you need to relate to. And then the second challenge we have is the piece we're missing if you compare with, say, football, cricket, or rugby, is they all have, sitting at the top, a national team which is quite important, which generates lots of profile, lots of money, and then feeds down. Where would cricket be in this country without the England team, without the Ashes series? The answer is in pretty poor shape. The county game is struggling right across the board. We don't have that equivalent. And so one of our challenges is, how do we get the GB national team up there, playing at home, part of the profile? And here's the challenge. The GB team at the London Olympics had 2 players playing in the UK. The rest were scattered across Europe, and our leader, Lual Deng, is paid $20 million to play for the Chicago Bulls per year. Salary, and then lots of endorsements on top of that. But we're not the only country facing that challenge, because France, who are the European silver medalists, had only one player from their domestic league in their French team at the London Olympics. 6 of their players are playing in the NBA. Australia, who have been a perennial basketball powerhouse, at the London Olympics only had 2 players from their national league. Most of their players are in the US or playing for Barca, Real Madrid, the top clubs. And what that then says is the ability to get your team together depends on you negotiating with a whole bunch of leagues around the world. And how do you do that? And we're facing a challenge that's coming very soon, because the international governing body, FIBA, wants to start to drive more national games, like football, during the season. How do you get the players together unless the NBA agree, the Euro League agree, all the national leagues agree? It's a massive negotiation. And there is a crunch coming. So our challenge of globalization is the global market's there. How do we work our way around that global market so we can have a regular GB program in the UK? And that matters intensely to the sport. I represent the league, but actually the league wants Great Britain to be performing. And we discussed this at the meeting of the European leagues in Barcelona only a few weeks ago. And one of the top teams in Europe is Greece. And Greece told us that their national team has not played in Greece since 2004 Athens Olympics. Ever since then, they've been playing on the road. So it's a challenge even Greece faces when they have quite a number of their players play in the Greek league. So that's our challenge. We're trying to grapple with it. We want to develop a program. We'd like the equivalent of an Ashes series or some other equivalent of Six Nations, because we think without that it'll always be a problem to get our profile up.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to views on governing bodies a bit later on. I believe Britt might have a few things to say on that. But before we hit rugby, let's go to football, or soccer to use those across the Atlantic.
It's soccer here too. Saturday morning on Sky.
I know very well. Deterioration of the language is dreadful. Tom, can you give us the perspective of the club? These are
sure.
These are sport and league perspectives. Let's have a perspective of a club.
Well, you scared me with your media caveat early, because I had a bad experience at a business conference in Dubai, where what I meant to say to a woman who I thought was a business reporter was the reason Emirates Airlines would agree to spend 150 million pounds with Arsenal is that the club is defined by more than winning, and it was misinterpreted by the Sun into winning isn't important. And I was lucky for me. I had the supporters drinks function immediately after that, and I had people coming up to me, "Did you really say that? Are you?" So I've been referred to as Tom Winning is an important fox. So
surely Arsene Wenger would agree.
No, I would not agree. So before I get started, I apologize to any Arsenal fans. I will speak and use the word brand, and I will talk about business. I have had letters from angry fans who have heard me refer to the club as a brand, and that has offended fans. And so I don't speak to fans and use the term brand, and I don't talk about revenues and business when I speak to fans, because, again, it's been a fairly painful learning process for me when I've done that. Our club has been on a fairly interesting journey for the past 8 to 10 years. 10 years ago, when the Premier League was defined really at the top by Manchester United and Arsenal winning and swapping trophies and competing with each other at a very high level, the club made a very, I think, bold decision at the time, and they looked forward into the future and said, if we're going to be successful, we need to leave our home of Highbury. We need to find a way to drive the revenues of our club. And they set out on a very ambitious journey to take the club from about 150 million pounds to 220 million pounds in revenue. And they did that really by pouring concrete, by finding the land and putting a great deal of effort. And that was a very visible symbol of the club's commercial progress, pouring concrete, building a stadium, and having a new source of revenue that could take the club from 150 to 220 million. We then set on a journey about 4 or 5 years ago, which was really defined by people. It was an exercise in building the capability at the club to take it from 220 million pounds to 300 million pounds, to be able to compete with what was happening with other clubs across Europe. And we now, on the back of the last 4 years and the team we've built and the strategy that we put in place and the commercial deals that are now coming to the fore, we see that in about a year and a half, we will be a club that's 300 million in revenue, and that will move us over into a slightly different category of clubs alongside really Bayern Munich in terms of the revenue we generate on our own, and create some separation between us and some of the other clubs in England and in Europe who really are limited by the lack of a big stadium. And no sooner had we gotten a view to 300 million pounds than the chief exec said, great, how do we get from 3 to 350? And we've spent a lot of time talking about that, and I will tell you that is a much more difficult exercise. Football teams are built very effectively around selling tickets to their stadium. The league support structure is built very effectively around taking live game action and commercializing that globally by selling television rights. And we sell a lot of tickets, we sell a lot of sponsorships, the Premier League maximizes the television revenue, but when you start to think about what it's going to take to get from 3 to 350, in our opinion, the model begins to change, and the questions are questions that I don't think really any individual team has asked and answered successfully. I think the NBA have done a great job, but their distinct advantage is that they have scale. So when the NBA goes into China, they're always representing the club that won the championship last year. We are one single football club. We are, as I said, about soon to be a 300 million pound business. We're expected to build our brand in China, Southeast Asia, Russia, the Indian subcontinent, and the United States. And we're really expected to do that without investing any of our own money, because sports teams and leagues don't use their own money. We use sponsor money and other people's money to build our brands. And so it becomes a bit of an interesting exercise. And I think for us, what's happening now, there's a couple things I think that are helping drive and focus our thinking. And really it's what the brands are talking about these days. The brands are now starting to talk about big data and their ability to understand the consumer on a global level and understand their behavior and understand what they're doing. And the whole social media conversation that allows people across the world to connect with each other and share experiences and live in communities that are sort of passionately grounded, we think creates a fantastic opportunity for us as a football club, because nothing has the power to engage people in a really positive way, we think quite like sport does. And so as we think about where we go and how we drive our revenue from 3 to 350, how we find those companies that look at our brand and say, yes, I want to associate with you and have you, I want to leverage the power of your club and your brand internationally, we really have to show those brands that we have a connected fan base globally. It's not enough to say that we have hundreds of hours of programming on television, that we're the second most watched club in the Premier League, that the Premier League is visible in 212 countries. Increasingly, it's not about our ability to say we have 450 million people who express some level of interest in our brand. It's actually more important for the companies and the brands we're working with to be able to say to them, those numbers are great, but really what we can offer you in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia specifically, and then within the city of Jakarta, 480,000 fans who are absolutely and utterly engaged in everything we're doing and come to us on a repeated basis looking for information that only we have, and they cannot get enough of it. And our ability to understand at a very granular level what's happening with the consumer as they engage with our sport is a massive advantage, and that's the language that the brands are looking for us to be able to speak, and that's the problem they're looking for us to be able to solve on their behalf. And I think the social media conversation is fantastic. I don't think by any stretch we've gotten it quite right, but just with a little bit of effort, creating content in local language and creating some virals in advance of our tour schedule that shows the consumer in those markets that we see them and we understand them, and we're not just there to play a game and take a match fee. We've seen the positive impact of those efforts. And so really for us, we go from defining what our business is as a football club, from transacting, selling a ticket, selling a program, selling a hot dog. We changed our business model from that level of transaction really into a more difficult thing to articulate. We translate it into what we call belonging, quite frankly. Our business is to find as big an audience as possible and make them feel as if they are a part of the club in the same way that the almost 60,000 people at Emirates Stadium last night felt, that connection to the club, that sort of tribal connection to the people in the section that they're sitting in, the feeling that the badge for them is representative of who they are and what they stand for, that the values that we stand for as a club are values that are also important to them. How can we extend that sense of belonging in a non-transactional way to as many people around the world as possible and get them to engage in a dialogue with us so that we can then turn that into meaningful conversations on behalf of our partners? And that is really, really difficult. I also think there are ways in which the disintermediation of media is going to really help us in that environment. So when I think about the way media is sold at the Premier League level right now, it's really wholesaled around the world. And there's a very thin staff of people at the Premier League who do a fantastic job, but really they go into a market and they want to find one broadcaster who will take those rights on an exclusive basis and exploit them in that marketplace. And we as the team who's looking to build our brand in that market are so far removed from the end consumer of that product that it makes it very difficult for us to leverage the power of that live game programming into a direct connection with that fan. And eventually, what I think is going to happen is there'll be a couple of steps in that process that don't necessarily need to be there. And the Premier League, at some point in the future, probably sooner than we think, will be in a position to retail our own live game programming and actually go direct to that consumer who we're trying to reach anyway. You know, Manchester United's trying to reach that consumer, Chelsea's trying to reach that consumer. All the big clubs are trying to understand who that consumer is, and what can help us more than anything is access to that live game programming. Not in a way that doesn't allow for revenue sharing across the league, but really league-wide allows the league to go in and create a direct connection to the consumer who's ultimately viewing that content. And I think the media companies that currently provide that signal understand that that's eventually where the world is headed. And I think that's a huge advantage for us, and hopefully that level of technology can help solve that problem and answer that question for us, because I don't think I've seen anyone do it very effectively to date, but that's really the question we're trying to answer.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, hopefully we'll maybe get some answers as we go on this afternoon, maybe challenges for all of you here. How can we help you? How can we help you like Arsenal? Okay, let's switch over to another sport. Let's go to rugby. Sure. With a quick aside about the effectiveness of the governing bodies, obviously.
Yes.
So over to you, Brett.
Well, governing bodies are always very controversial and seen as very conservative, and are usually a butt of jokes and so on. But that's just the way it is, I guess. I haven't been in the sports business actually very long. I've only really been in it for 7-8 months now, and I come from marketing and communications industry, and so probably go about things in a slightly different way, and we'll discover later down the track that I got it completely wrong, but I do come at it from a little bit of a different positioning. I mean, the first thing in terms of global growth, the IRB itself has to decide what its priority is, in my view, and the IRB has always traditionally been a regulator of the game, and my view, which is where we're pointing the organisation towards, we will always be a regulator of the game, the rules, the laws, the bylaws, the whatever. But given the properties that we own, and we don't own as many properties as people think, we don't own the Six Nations, we don't own the Super Rugby, we don't own the Championship, which is the former Tri-Nations and so on. We certainly don't own the Heineken Cup. No one knows who owns that at the moment. Actually, at the end of the day, we own the World Cup, which happens every 4 years. It makes a lot of money for the sport each 4 years, and then we spend the next 4 years basically using that money to develop the game around the world, and that's the model of the IRB. So as we increasingly own inventory, whether it be the World Cup, we now have a staggering growth of sevens throughout the world in non-traditional markets as well as traditional markets with HSBC World Series. We also have the Olympics, which has come onto our regimen. The idea is for the needle in terms of development to happen, to move from being a regulator of the game to an inspirer of the game. And therefore, what you need to do in terms of the bodies you have in the building and the attitude that you have is actually quite different from when you're just a regulator. And as a regulator, you tend to be a secretive organisation hidden in Dublin without even a plaque on the wall saying who you are. If you're trying to inspire the game, unfortunately, you have to suddenly build up a relationship with the fans. And again, we haven't got the direct connection with fans because we don't own players, clubs, teams, whatever. But we believe our point of view on the sport counts as an aggregator of potentially eyeballs, but also of an aggregator of passion for the sport globally, and that's part of our desire to spread the word about rugby. So going about it in a normal way, we have a positioning which we think differentiates us from other sporting codes. It's not a differentiating positioning which other codes couldn't adopt, but we've adopted it earlier and therefore staked our claim on it, and we feel we're more legitimate in that positioning. We believe we have values in our sport that are visibly different, not just on paper, visibly different to other sports that we compete against, that are attractive to parents who want their children to go into the sport, to people playing the sport, people watching the sport, and so on. And I think, when rugby talks about its values, if you know rugby, you understand what they are. If you don't know rugby, why would you understand? It sounds a bit like puffery. So we tried to find a positioning that could clarify the values of the sport. Now, actually, the IRB has 5 values. And when I try and say them, I remember 4 of them usually, so I'm not going to attempt. I was at the RFU the other day, they have 6. Only 2 of theirs are ours, which shows you what you sort of compete against. But anyway, in rugby, when you talk about those, everyone knows what you stand for. What we talk about as a positioning is that we believe that rugby is character building, or has been since 1823, when in an active character, William Webb Ellis picked up a football actually, which Gilbert reminds me was a Gilbert ball made in rugby, and now they do rugby balls, in 1823. So our positioning is very much about character building. And sport is character building, but we think rugby is particularly character building, and the way we talk about and activate, and increasingly will do so, is around the area of how that is something which is brand enhancing for us, enhancing for players. It is obviously commercial in the sense that if I'm a brand and I want to associate myself with a sport, which may be part of your strategy, some of it may be just complete activation, but if you're looking to enhance your brand, then surely if you're associated with a brand which is about character building, it's got to be something which is interesting for your brand to be associated with. So that's generally the positioning that we work to. We try to tell the difference between participation growth and viewing growth. And I think the American brands are very good at viewing growth that we can learn a lot of lessons off. I say the American brands, I'm talking NBA, NFL, etc. They're very good at gaining popularity through media, not necessarily on the playing field. And in the past, and in the future to a certain extent, federations are obsessed by participatory growth, and I think we should make sure we're doing both. And one doesn't necessarily, they interact very well. They're not necessarily the same thing, and I think we have in the past seen them as the same thing. I'll hit some quick points, so I'm taking my time up. Obviously, 7s versus 15s is a huge thing in the growth of the game. We are using 7s as a growth driver, not just for itself, but for 15s. It is a fantastic sampling and portal for the sport of 15s. There are conservative elements in rugby that worry, as in cricket, that 2020 will take over from Test cricket, which may be the case. We're very cautious that's not the case, but we know that it's growing the game in parts of the world where since 1823 no one's bothered to get interested in it, and it's our job to make sure that 7s is actually going to get people interested in 15s as well. I talked about the Olympic opportunity. That's obviously for any sport. Gives you huge legitimacy across the world, but gives you funds from governments and National Olympic Committee. And it puts you on the curriculum compulsorily of many countries like Russia, Eastern European countries, parts of China, and so on. You are automatically put on the curriculum, so therefore you're growing your grassroots just by the mere fact you're at the Olympics. Our position of character building plays into the 2 biggest threats in sport, which is gambling, match fixing, and drug cheats. And we think that sets us up very well in terms of laying out our stall on those issues. And we obviously, the 2 issues that are the most important, we work with our unions for this, is there's obviously grassroots level, how do you get into the sport? At the very bottom level, what's going to cause you to get into it? And of course the creation of heroes, the hero factory, being so important for any sports federation, and that's very much in our strategy as well. So they're just some of the key points for the International Rugby Board.
Many thanks indeed. Excellent. Okay, last but not least, we have Rick, who I think is going to be talking about the Football League perspective rather than the club perspective, and particularly, I think, the role of TV rights.
Yeah, I mean, globalisation of football is a massive topic, let alone globalisation of sport. So I'm going to focus initially, at least, on the Premier League. And because this is a very smart audience, I'm going to throw out some numbers and maybe throw out a few that you haven't quite seen before or haven't seen presented in this way. I think the success of the Premier League, Tom's alluded to in terms of generating international TV revenues, has been pretty spectacular. When we started the league, which seems like a long time ago, 1992, the value of the international TV rights was 8 million a year. We thought that was pretty successful because, believe it or not, in 1991 the Football League lost money on the overseas TV rights, which takes some doing. Currently 479 million a year, so grown by a factor of 60. That's pretty impressive by any analysis. Domestic rights have grown pretty spectacularly too, but interestingly only by a factor of 16. So the overseas rights, which were 20% of the value of the domestic in 92, are now 70% of the value of the domestic rights. Nobody would have forecast that. It is pretty extraordinary. Top territories are actually really interesting because I bet most people wouldn't necessarily guess what they are. In the next round of deals which have just been concluded, Middle East and North Africa comes out top, 225 million over 3 years. Sub-Saharan Africa, 205 million. Thailand, 200. Singapore, 190. USA, 157. China, way down the list, which is kind of interesting, but indicates some potential for growth. India coming up. India's kind of grown from 18 million to 91 million in the next deals. India is definitely a coming territory. Why has this happened? Why the growth? I think there are 5 reasons. I think the key reason is actually volume. It's a fairly boring one, but it's volume. Again, back in 92, we televised 60 live games in the Premier League. We were pilloried for televising too many. I remember that graphically. It's indelibly tattooed upon me, the criticism we got. And all the other games were covered by 2 camera crews. It was kind of to try and pick up the goals for Match of the Day, but it certainly wasn't broadcast standard. So effectively, the only games that were sold live overseas were the 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon games. Now we have 154 games live a season, and looking at the windowing, the Premier League is really interesting. We have the Saturday lunchtime, Saturday tea time, Sunday lunchtime, Sunday tea time, and the priorities have changed markedly. In the old days, it was Sunday afternoon, 4 o'clock, that was the prime time, those were the big games. Now going forwards, the midday Saturday slot, no surprise, very popular in Asia, that has 15 first picks. Priorities are definitely shifting, all to accommodate the overseas markets. So huge volume growth and the availability of matches for sale. Second factor is the influx of foreign players post the Bosman decision in the mid-90s. We now have 65% foreign players, more than anywhere else. That has downsides, it has upsides. The upsides are it attracts the foreign audiences. Third reason, the product is actually pretty exciting, of course. We have a competitive league compared with many of the others. Gap between top and bottom is relatively small. Anything can happen. Fourth reason, very important, and these are not in order of priority, by the way, but the fourth reason, which Tom was alluding to, actually the fantastic work that our major clubs are doing in promoting themselves. There is, when I was at the Premier League, we didn't promote the Premier League brand too heavily. We did it with a very light hand because we recognised that what was most important to us was the strength of the individual clubs. They were the you don't relate to a league, you relate to a club, you support a club. So the work that Arsenal, that Man U, that Chelsea, now Man City and Liverpool have done has driven the popularity of the league. That, of course, leads as well to attention, because when we set up the league, because the overseas rights were important, it was agreed they'd all be shared equally amongst the clubs. unlike the domestic formula, and certainly the major clubs have, over the years, started to grumble a little on the basis we're driving all the revenues, we're driving the popularity. What about the share of the revenues? And that isn't going to go away. Fifth reason, and again Tom touched on this, I think it's the same reason that rights have grown here. It's competition within the local markets, shifted from terrestrial in the early days to pay TV. We're seeing the same pattern everywhere. And indeed, you know, what's interesting too, because one of the other factors that in terms of the globalisation of the Premier League is globalisation of ownership. I was the first victim of that, I think it's fair to say. But more than half the clubs now in foreign ownership. We'd never have predicted that. That's a pretty extraordinary statistic. And no great coincidence that the highest generating region in terms of revenues is Middle East and North Africa, and it was Abu Dhabi Media who paid the phenomenal rights fees, not totally disconnected with the ownership of a Manchester club. So there's a kind of, there's a little virtuous circle operating there. One of the slightly controversial things I'd like to throw in though in terms of globalisation is that we kind of, when we talk globalisation, we talk revenues, we talk income, we talk generating money. And one of the slightly surprising things is, and it's a paradox, is that the Premier League clubs and the Premier League actually operate extremely badly when it comes to controlling costs on a global stage. We don't have an efficient market in salary costs. We actually just have an arms race in which the clubs compete against themselves. And all these stats are kind of out there, but it's interesting to analyse them in a slightly different way. And it's really interesting that between 96-97 is the last deal of the first Premier League TV deal, which was, we thought was big at the time, but looks pretty small now. But since 96-97, wages in the Premier League have risen by 1.5 billion euros. I'm doing it in euros because I'm going to do some international comparisons. That is 79% of the increase in revenues. Wages increase up by 79%. Whereas over the same period, if you look at our key competitors in terms of popularity of leagues, quality of players, Spain and Germany, Spain's wages have increased by 770 million euros, just over half. Germany, 700 million euros, less than half of our increase, which is from an economic standpoint is kind of crazy. And indeed, another way of analysing that is that compared with our nearest rival, back in 96-97, our revenues have increased by 635 million. Our wages have increased compared with our nearest rival by 609. So the whole increase we've just kind of given away. So you say, well, so why bother? And the fact that I think financial fair play, cost control is now being debated is probably long overdue. And everybody is now talking about Germany. So there's another kind of interesting stat in terms of the Bundesliga. Again, back in 96-97, the operating profit of Premier League clubs was 127 million euros. The operating profit of Bundesliga clubs was 37. 2011 operating profit of Premier League clubs was 78 million. Bundesliga 171. So we maybe have a little bit to learn. Looking ahead, I'm an enormous optimist in terms of is there growth still to come? Is there any more to go at? Yeah, I'm convinced there is. And I think that, again, Tom was starting to go into this. The whole impact of new technologies is going to be absolutely fascinating. Really interesting announcement from BT last week on its pricing strategy in terms of the first time a rights holder is actually trying to drive something other than the TV markets. BT's pricing is all driven by broadband. First time that's happened. And if you look at what the Premier League has done out of its relationship with Sky, it's done incredibly well. Sky has bankrolled the Premier League since the beginning, but Sky itself has also done phenomenally well. From a loss of 76 million in '93 now to an operating profit of 1.2 billion. phenomenally successful company, but all done on a subscriber base of just over 10 million. That is actually a tiny number in global terms. When you consider that in 2015 alone, within the 12 months of 2015, Apple are going to sell 150 million iPads. By 2015, there will be 500 million homes connected to the TVs connected to the internet. You know, the changing landscape of that is going to be amazing. And the interesting thing with that, of course, is what does it mean in terms of geographical boundaries? What is the relevance of national boundaries when that happens? Because we're talking truly multinational coverage. And we've seen BT come in. At what time do we see Apple, Google, Microsoft, YouTube bidding for rights? We see YouTube now buying content. We see Netflix commissioning content. The world is going to be a very different place, I think, in 10 years. Great opportunities to come. And my last controversial bit, I'm going to divert from the Premier League. I've spent 3 years kind of travelling the globe, doing bits and pieces, east and west. Huge believer in the development of soccer in the States. Population of 300 million plus, same as the population of the 5 key leagues in Europe added together, so I think it's going to absolutely fly. But if it really wants to fly, I would merge the Mexican League with the MLS. Discuss.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got a whole bundle of questions, but I think what's probably best is give you a chance to ask your questions, and I'll come back and push the other questions. So, discuss technology, global fan bases, leagues, whatever your questions are. Give your name as well and background. And
my name is Ian Parks. I'm from New Zealand and I play rugby. This is a question for Brett. So we're talking about global sport. In rugby, we've got a very strong competition in Europe, domestic and national, and a very strong competition in the Southern Hemisphere, domestic and national. And there's always been this sort of talk around a global competition. What's the IRB's view on that, and do you have any timeline on maybe a merging of those competitions?
They've locked them. If you're talking about a sort of a global calendar,
yeah,
and some interaction between two companies, they've locked themselves into rooms on many occasions to try and work out what could be a global calendar that could allow that kind of synergy. And you just can't get agreement from all parties to the point where there's no plan at this stage to get back in a room again. And I think the last meeting was about 18 months ago in Woking. My view is if they'd chosen Versailles, they might have got a result, but it was in Woking. And they couldn't have come to that. So we've got a very delicate system now where the game is really mostly the money comes. Rugby union is only an 18-year-old professional sport, generates £1.2 billion in commercial activity each year. So it's actually a much bigger sport than people think it is. But most of that generation of commercial revenue comes out of the international game, and there are 2 windows, which are June and November, controlled by the IRB, and they're quite delicate. So no one wants to upset that balance of the business. The simple answer is there is no plan at this point, because of the realities of the trouble in getting it done, to have a completely synergised Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere program. But we will come back to it at some point.
Seems to me that a generic point is actually, as you're all growing, trying to globalise, actually scheduling is becoming incredibly important. Like as basketball, you commented on your notes. Is that a problem?
Yeah, and the interesting point that was made at our meeting when we were discussing it was all these discussions are taking place, but nobody's talking to the players. And the players have to be able to perform in all these competitions, and there is a limit to what level of performance they can give on a regular basis.
Someone right back there.
Hi, my name is Federico. I'm from Argentina as well, a rugby player. I think it's very interesting what they talked about from the basketball perspective, because for Argentina it's also a huge deal in rugby and in basketball as well as in football, how you coordinate amongst the federation and the clubs. I would like to know, Brett, your perspective from the IRB, and also what do you think the solutions might be in the way federations and clubs will handle that relationship in the future?
It's in our code, it's different across the world. Actually, the 2 biggest rugby markets are France and the UK. they're the only two markets where actually the unions in those countries have relinquished control over the clubs in a way. They obviously have agreements, they regulate the sport at the union level, but really the players are paid by the clubs, and therefore the clubs have supremacy in that relationship. If you go Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the clubs were not really clubs actually, they were provinces or states, and therefore they were part of the union structure. So the nations in that part of the world can control. Argentina's a different situation because all their players are playing in Europe. The federations can control those clubs. As the clubs become richer, as they wield more clout in the Northern Hemisphere, as they are increasingly growing and so on, that rapport of force or that Indian arm wrestle is going to become interesting. I don't know what the outcome is, but obviously there will be deals struck so that players can be released for the windows, so that the game can make money on an international basis, but there's got to be a huge respect for the clubs in the fact that they're businesses and they make money. And that tension exists in Europe now. It's a very, very difficult one. You have a lot of foreign players in France. France is a place where there's no ceiling on the salaries. In the UK there is a salary ceiling and cap, and there is obviously attraction to foreign players going and playing in the UK and France from all over the world. And actually Japan probably pays the highest salaries at their clubs because they're owned by the Toshibas, the Canons, the Toyotas and so on. So to get those players back from the clubs so they can generate money with the international season is governed in our sport by Regulation 9, which means clubs must release those players during the windows. But we still get a lot of issues in them pretending to release but not releasing. The player says, I don't want to play, we don't know if it's true. So it's a difficult Indian arm wrestle between club and international game, between the unions and the clubs. And that will change as the clubs get stronger, which they will.
A question now not on rugby. Yes, thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Nav Kaplish. My question is really for Tom and Rick. I know Rick mentioned India as a market growing. Other than the TV rights increase, what other opportunities for monetization do you see going forward in the next 5 or 10 years in a market like India or in a market like China, for example?
You want me to start that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, India is a real interesting market because there's a huge population, but everyone assumes that it's so focused on cricket that you can't penetrate it. In fact, you've got, I think, 25% of the world's population under 25 living on the Indian subcontinent, and actually they're looking for something other than cricket, I think, is certainly the conventional wisdom. Whether that's entirely true or not, I'm not sure anybody's tested that theory. First of all, television is the first avenue into any market for any league and any sport because it gives you an idea of what your fan base looks like, gives you an idea of what the interest is, and it sells your game and all the individual club brands within that game well in advance of you as a club having to go in and devote your resources to it. We actually just signed an agreement with a company called India on Track, and I would tell you, and I would have told you a couple of years ago, that the model of creating either soccer academies or soccer schools was completely non-scalable, required too much time and effort, and was just absolutely the model we should not follow, because trying to get kids to play the Arsenal way and to do that properly requires coaching from your first team and your reserve squads on a regular basis to really deliver an experience that is truly unique to that Arsenal soccer school and therefore worthy of the brand, as opposed to just a place where kids are playing soccer. Quite frankly, you travel around the world, you look at every soccer school that's branded with a football club, the football looks very similar. Having said that, that's exactly what we decided to do with India on Track, because it's not a market where we have a great deal of resources that we're able to focus on right now. So this was a company that said, we believe in football in this market. We believe we need to get those kids, the under 25 population, playing the game. We can franchise, we can scale, we know how to do it. And they really impressed us operationally. And quite frankly, because we don't have a lot of other resources to really go in and put on the ground and start to sell sponsorships, because it really, we'd be out in front of the consumer demand for the product. So starting to build the game at the grassroots level seemed to make a lot of sense with this particular partner and begin to give us some brand awareness. We are so focused on Southeast Asia, China, and you know, some of the Eastern European markets, and quite frankly, we're focused on it because that's where the brands that we're working with are focused. We're not focused on North America, even though I agree with Rick, there's a huge opportunity there, because not one single brand that we work with says, you know what, if only we could be successful in North America, can you help us? There's plenty of other sports that can get them in front of the consumer if they want to use sports marketing, and quite frankly, that's a mature market for just about every business on the planet. There are US businesses that are starting to lift their head up and say, as I expand my brand globally, what can I use? And the global game of football is increasingly becoming an answer. But India, I think it's very early in that process. There haven't been teams touring there yet, and I think we're dipping our toe in the water with a view towards building something meaningful in the future.
Hi, my name's Jonathan. I'm an MBA from last year. I work for an online retailer. Part of my job is to set up fan clubs, so hopefully I'll talk later. But my main question is about the merchandising side of the business. It wasn't mentioned. We've got tickets and TV.
Yeah.
What are the growth plans for that as in EPL, in the Premier League, and also I suppose in the leagues?
You know, quite frankly, beyond the business that all the clubs do with their primary kit provider, no one's doing that business successfully, business to consumer, anywhere in the world. So 3.5 years ago, we had 120 stores through a licensee in China, and we shut every single one of them down because a single brand retail around a football club barely works outside your stadium footprint in this country, let alone in China. So online is the future for us. We just signed a deal with AEG on the back of their concert apparel business. They're going to now be our online retail provider in China. They've got scale, they've got resource, but quite frankly, it's not a huge game changer for us. It's important, and as we develop consumer demand, we want to meet the demand for products so that they can wear the badge and show that they're a fan of the football club. And we're focusing resources on it, but it's got to be online because it requires too many boots on the ground to even consider bricks and mortar retail in all of these markets simultaneously. And online is changing the way we'll go about it. The revenue from merchandising and from licensing comes primarily from Nike. They're the ones that give us the distribution in the markets around the most expensive and most sought after product. And the rest of the licensing business is fairly de minimis. Won't always be that way once we begin to create the connection with this global fan base, once we put them through sort of a dedicated CRM system and start that dialogue, know who they are, where they are, and what they want, we can then match that up with a retail partner. But for us, that's a little further down the track.
I'm Jim Davis, due to start on the MBA in August. Question for Rick primarily, but also Tom, be interested in your thoughts as well. Rick, you mentioned the excitement of the Premier League being one of the key reasons for the growth. What role do you see the financial fair play regulations playing in the maintenance of that excitement? And more generally, how are they going to develop, do you think, given that they're not necessarily mandatory for all 20 teams in the Premier League at this point in time?
What is it mandatory for?
The financial fair play regulations yet? So
well,
from UEFA for those competing in UEFA competitions.
I mean, there will be, because the Premier League is now adopting its own regulations.
Regardless of the legal action recently?
Yeah, the impoverished agent who is taking sport to court on a restraint of trade basis, that'll win a lot of public sympathy. Yeah, I mean, I think Tom will probably violently disagree with this, but it's quite easy to criticise the approach UEFA and the Premier League have taken to financial fair play because it does preserve the existing order. No surprise Manchester United were backing it so strongly because where you're essentially saying that teams have got to survive on their own revenue, then very difficult for anybody to break in and compete. But having said that, clearly from some of the numbers I was quoting in terms of the losses, the wages, you've got to start somewhere. And in football, and having worked in governing bodies, my motto is the opposite of doing nothing is doing something. It ain't perfect, but if you can just start somewhere, then you've done something. Again, I actually quite like the German approach, which they've been doing for years. They don't have a break-even test. They have always just had a fairly blunt instrument that says you can't have debt, which which is actually quite smart in many ways, and you could see why the Glazers didn't want to back that. But it's kind of worked. Well, it hasn't always worked in Germany because Dortmund and Schalke have had huge problems. But I don't think the rules we've now got will be the rules that we necessarily see in 5 or 10 years on financial controls. But as I said, at least, particularly with a huge hike in the TV rights coming, it's actually quite gratifying to see something being done and a marker in the sand. So, it's a start, but it certainly won't be the finish.
I'd say a few things to add to that. I actually don't really disagree. The risk is it does lock in the status quo, and I certainly understand that, and that may be true. I think the excitement of the Premier League today is driven off of the fact that we are today sharing the largest portion of revenue across all of our clubs than we have at any point since the creation of the league, and that's, as Rick points out, because international is split on an even basis, 1/20th per club, and those revenues are growing faster. And I actually think what makes the Premier League the most exciting league to watch is that it is not a two-horse race at the beginning of every season, although Man United ran away with it this year. There's competition across the board. If there wasn't, the television product wouldn't be as sought after around the world. There are mid-table games that are interesting to watch because those clubs play a style of football that people find attractive. And on the back of the new television deals, 20 of the 40 richest clubs in Europe will be the Premier League clubs. So the buying power of every one of our clubs will be significant. And so you'll get the top few teams in every league who can sort of outspend our clubs, but actually not many below that. And every club in the Premier League will have the financial means to go out and buy players and build an academy and invest in their infrastructure and do the things they need to do to be successful. And I think that will create excitement and longevity. I think, financial fair play, first of all, I think it's a bad name, fair play. It's tough to argue with something when you call it fair. Really what it's trying to do is prevent what Rick indicated, which is the prune juice effect of a pound of revenue coming in and £1.10 going out the back door because there's no controls on salary. And it's because we all compete in a global marketplace. When someone comes in and spends money that isn't generated in the game, we have to try to compete with that. All clubs have to try to compete with that, and it changes the economics fundamentally. I think the interesting thing to me about it is it's not a rule that UEFA has decided it's going to implement, and the clubs are being dragged kicking and screaming into that regime. It's actually widely supported across all of the ECA and just about every club in Europe. This has broad support. A lot of people are looking for mechanisms to control spending within the game. This seems like one way to do it. UEFA have put a lot of time and effort behind it. You've got the case in the Premier League where obviously there's probably going to be some court action there, and I think I would be surprised if you didn't see court action with various clubs in Europe and UEFA, and I think it's inevitable. But actually, what they're trying to do is create some set of restrictions on player wages that exist in the U.S. because of salary caps and other reasons. They're trying to do that, and I completely agree with Rick. Doing something is better than nothing. And I think the risk is that it does lock in the status quo, so let's have that conversation. Let's talk about what we can continue to do as a Premier League to make sure that things that are special about our league, that make it the biggest and most watched league in the world, that we continue to do those things and we continue to strengthen those areas that make us a real differentiated brand within the world of sport. So he's right on that, but I do think that's a conversation we're all willing to have on some level.
My question's for Alistair, actually. My name's Amish Manik, I've been an MBA student here, and I'm also on the board of the England Basketball Association. So, given Kevin's comments earlier, we're starting to renegotiate the licensing deal as of Thursday. Might take a slightly different turn of events now, I think. But the question that I had was really understanding the difference between the NFL structure versus the governing body in the US for the NFL sport, and actually what role the governing body plays in popularizing the sport from a participation point of view, and what role the NFL plays in that.
Okay. So we're a commercial private league, 32 teams. We've increased that number slowly over time, but for the most part, that's the number that we stick to. There's a very high barrier to entry in terms of getting into it, and Tom talks about sharing of revenues. We share 80% of our domestic revenues amongst 32 teams, and even if you win Super Bowl, you're not actually going to financially benefit from that side. we are in charge of running our league and our rules and our state of play. There's a governing body or a federation called USA Football that we work with, that fund, that's more responsible for youth programming and all forms of regional playing. There are coaching federations and a number of other different bodies that we work closely with. Because we're the public face of the professional side of the sport, and because of the revenues that we generate, ours is much more about assisting and help shaping. And there's a very clear demarcation. But we aim wherever possible to find synergies where there are benefits on both sides. But for the most part, most of the funding that we do is not with the intention of it being very prescriptive. Very much still for the federation to work out how it works. USA Football feeds into IFAF, which is the International Football Federation, and we have I think it's close to 100 countries now. They're all built in, and there's a funding structure through there as well that the NFL supports.
Back.
It's another question related to the NFL. Given that you're competing against, on your right, left and right, to the sports that are actually being played by the masses in the UK and in Europe in general, NFL Europe did take off for a bit, but it was quite a small initiative as it is. You've obviously are tackling the fact that people don't play by putting the best product in front of them, both live and through TV. But it's just a grassroots initiative, as you mentioned. But how long is it before you actually have to put a team in London and start attracting that interest? Since you don't have, let's say, what Kevin suggested with putting Team GB or a national team or having a EuroLeague final here, how far away are you from that? And I presume you're also competing with that with the NBA, because it's a little bit of a first come, first serve on this in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, my view, it's going to sound like a politician's answer, but I actually genuinely mean it, unlike a lot of politicians. I don't believe that we're competing against other sports. I believe that we're competing against leisure time in general. So I've never gone in on the basis of how are we doing against other sports. In my lifetime, we'll never be as big as the Premier League in this country. So our perspective is we're additive. Now, I don't know many people who love only one sport and are only devoted to that one sport. And so instead, what we do is we turn it into opportunities. So because of time zones, we play at different times to other sports. Our Sunday night games, in this country, we're up against La Liga. So that's probably the closest that I would say is competition. And certainly from an American sport perspective, I don't see other American sports as competition, because I don't think sports fans necessarily completely define themselves based on culture. They define themselves based on the sport that they like. In terms of a team in London, I think it's scale of fan base. What's interesting about our sport is that we're built on less is more. So there's only 8 home games in a season, and we restrict supply substantially in order to increase demand. And so therefore, when you think about it more in terms of you need to sell out 8 home games and 2 pre-season games, that doesn't sound a massive stretch. But if it's going to be sustainable, you probably need to be around about triple the fan base from where we're currently at. So the way I look at it is that the last 5-6 years was about proving a concept, because in the same way as the 39th game for the Premier League going abroad was massively controversial, if you're a home team in the NFL and you're being asked to give up 1/8 of your season, that's a major issue. By proving that it works, that teams that have gone on to played at Wembley have then gone on to win Super Bowl, I've ended up trying to position like a politician, and this time I really am a politician, that London is a lucky charm, and that you should come over and play here. But if we can triple the fan base, we will have already proved logistically that we can do it. then that would probably say that we could sustain it from a fan perspective.
Time for one final question. Yes, over here.
Hi, Ben from Two Circles. My question comes in 2 points, I guess. First one is, what would be the objective of globalising a league, Rick, or a club, Tom, other than clearly the commercial gains? And then how do you manage, the flip side to that, the domestic status quo? So you've got 65% of Premier League, for instance, a foreign, lot of foreign investment. How do you turn that globalisation in terms of maintaining your domestic, i.e. grassroots level? How do you balance those two conflicts?
I think one of the things we're not very good at in this country is balancing things. And part of that comes back to governing bodies, because I think where the Premier League kind of took off and has done extremely well, the FA has kind of probably gone backwards. And I'm not sure that's a terribly good thing. I thought it was a great thing when I was running the Premier League to have a dormant governing body, but in terms of the good of the game, then it's sometimes useful to have the checks and balances. And as I said, you kind of wake up one day and think, well, we've got 65% foreign players and nearly the same percentage of foreign owners. How do we put the genie back in the bottle? And the answer is you don't. It's kind of it's a bit too late for that. We are where we are. There are pluses, there are minuses, but you kind of look at other countries and think that would never happen in Germany, it would never happen in Spain, it would never happen in Italy. I was doing a global emerging markets conference in New York last week with Goldman Sachs, which is sort of business oriented, but they wanted some stuff on football and globalization, and the point was made that our kind of light touch regulation in terms of football kind of mirrors what we do in a much broader way in terms of our approach to industry and banking, and again the Germans wouldn't quite do it this way, so we do kind of build up trouble for ourselves. And in terms of what was the objective of globalization other than making more money, there probably wasn't one in truth. When we started the league, the aim wasn't to be live in 212 countries and have international revenues 70% of the domestic. We'd have thought, if anybody had suggested that, we'd have thought they were completely crazy. So it's been incremental, it's grown, it's been organic, and as I said, it's been immensely successful in terms of the revenue generation. And when Tom talks about the rich list, well, it's not a rich list, it's kind of a poor list, because we kind of spend everything we generate. Rich list to me is the amount you keep, not the amount you throw away. So we've got one side of the profit and loss account right, but haven't done terribly well on the other side.
I mean, we're a football club first and foremost, and our club exists to make our fans feel proud, and our fans feel proud when we win, and we act in a way that's representative of their values, but mostly when we win. So that's why we're doing what we're doing, and so our chasing of commercial revenue is designed to do one thing, to make us better as a football club so that we win and make our fans feel proud. That's it. And so there is, I hear people say sometimes Arsenal's been prioritizing the commercial side of the business over the football side of the business, and I quite frankly don't even understand the statement, because there is no business, there is only football. The business is doing nothing but supporting the football. No one at our club is taking money out. Everything we generate goes back into the football club to make it more successful, to try to drive more pride amongst our fans. So there happens to be a global opportunity. Our asset is very valuable in other parts of the world. Only 12% of all the eyeballs that are viewing the Premier League are sitting in the United Kingdom. 88% of them are somewhere else in the world, and they're engaging with us on social media and in other, through our own club website and through content on YouTube and iTunes at a dramatically increasing rate. And so I think we have an obligation to go chase that business and exploit that business in order to make the football club perform better. In terms of the tension domestically, I guess, I've been in the league for 4 years. I don't really see it. And maybe it's the same tension that exists between the fans and the terraces who look at our fans on club level that they call the prawn sandwich eaters, and sort of refer to them in derisory terms. Actually, the reason, you hear about Emirates being the most expensive ticket in the Premier League, it's actually not. We have tickets that are £25.50 for many Premier League matches, but it is an expensive season ticket because we package 26 together. But one of the reasons it's not more expensive is because the 9,000 seats in club and box generate as much revenue as all of Highbury did on its own. So those prawn sandwich eaters allow us to keep the ticket prices where they are. We've taken 2 price increases in 7 years at the football club. Those people do that. So I guess I'd look at the international opportunity if there is some tension and say, well, actually it's those international fans who just want to be a part of the football club like you do that will help us generate the revenue that will enable us to compete with Barcelona and Bayern and Man United. That's really what it's all about. There is no business, there's only the football club, and we're just trying to do what we can do to be successful there.
So one question for myself, ready for the group. This is our sports business club. Have you any advice to give to the people here about those who want to enter this business of sport?
Simon Cummings, right there. I mean, I'll have one bit of advice because people ask all the time, that get any experience that you can doing whatever you can instead of trying to walk directly out of any role right into the sports business. Some people do it that way, but everyone in our organization, no matter where they sit within the club, has skills that they've developed somewhere else. So if you're selling anything, you can sell at our football club. If you're pitching a partnerships business, if you've pitched other types of business, if you've been in a client-facing role, no matter what it is, you're going to be right for me. Our general counsel, Svenja Geismar, came from the entertainment business. She didn't grow up wanting to be in sport, but she's a competent intellectual property lawyer. And so I'd say it's all about the experience you can bring to the football club and get as much of that and get as credible in your field as you can be.
Anybody would like to add to that?
No, I would totally agree. In fact, it would be a lesson I'd give to a lot of our politicians as well. Go out and do something else and bring that experience back to running government. It's those other experiences that are going to make the difference. I mean, we've been talking in isolation here, but it is quite a competitive market that we're operating in. English Premier League is on the up, but there are threats out there from all sorts of things. And understanding competition and its role, which you can get from a wide variety of industries, and how to react to the competitive challenge is something that you should find from the broadest range. Many of my years have been in engineering, and that's a bloody competitive industry with very low margins.
And I'd actually be interested with the group, how many, I think people that in the industry today that are hiring aren't necessarily looking for people that have sports experience. They're looking for people outside, whether it's in the consulting or the banking world, to come in and help us solve these problems. Is that true of your organization?
Absolutely right. I mean, a lot of people think because you've got a passion for sport, that qualifies you to get a job in sport. And actually, it's good to have that, but it can get in the way if you're not careful as well. So the idea is to get a skill set that's required, and sport is becoming, it has been for a long time, increasingly a business. And the skill sets, the education, etc., it's the same as the rest of the market. And you've got to be good at what you do, and having experience and bringing a fresh perspective is always good. I mean, the other thing I'd say is have patience. It took me 25 years to get a sports job, and I actually probably wasn't pushing for one for those 25 years. But I'm glad I'm doing something that I'm passionate about and I enjoy. It doesn't feel like work, even though it's probably I'm working harder than I've ever worked in my life. I mean, I've come out of the ad business, and believe me, they work pretty hard in that.
I would add 2 more things from my perspective. One is the importance of networking. That's true of all forms of business, but this is quite a much smaller industry than people realise, and opportunities, like lots of small industries, come out from favours and who you know. So and don't do it in straight lines. Some of it will be quite random. And then I think the second thing, building on what you just said, a big turn-off, I think, is actually when people apply and say that it's all about the passion that they have for the sport, because that's not a differentiator. You're there with millions of others. Whenever you're applying for any form of work, you're actually trying to differentiate yourself from every other candidate. And so one of the ways you can do it is actually to spend more time thinking about whether you actually understand the fan's perspective, not your perspective of the sport, but the fan and the organisation that you're trying to apply to and what they're trying to achieve. If you understand both the corporate culture and what they're expecting from their connections with fans, you'll differentiate yourself automatically.
Well, on a positive note, I just say there has never been a better time to be thinking about a career in sport. And it's pretty much right to say when we started the Premier League in '92, amongst the 22 clubs that were then members, I don't think there was a graduate employed. Honestly, these were people who'd come up as kind of time servers from within the game, and I was kind of viewed with suspicion because I had some professional qualifications. Well, so it's a lot better now, and there are a myriad of opportunities.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Can I thank all the panel for this wonderful segment, all their insights into the broad aspects of different perspectives of globalization. Thank you very much indeed.